Welcome, friends. This is a web novel. Imagination is key to enjoy it fully. Please like, subscribe, and gives your feedback.
The rest of the way to the tall hill did not take a lot of time. With Nephice leading the way, taking all the right turns at all the right places, there was no need to explore the labyrinth and backtrack after encountering a dead end. Additionally, there were no scavengers around. In fact, they could have moved ever quicker if not for Kasha, who walked slowly even with the help of her staff. Guided by the golden rope, she carefully explored the ground ahead before taking each step. The uneven paths of the Crimson Forest were not an ideal surface for a blind person to walk on. Sunny didn't say much, periodically casting an incredulous glance at the strange pair. No matter how he looked at it, Kasha seemed to be dead weight. Perhaps it was cruel to say, but in the merciless reality of the dream realm, misguided kindness was a sure way to end up dead. Before meeting and observing the girls, he still had hoped that Kasha's terrible flaw hid an unexpected and powerful aspect. But from what he saw, it wasn't the case. If she couldn't even walk properly, what kind of power was there to hide? Nothing could outweigh the ruthless fact that the blind girl couldn't protect herself, and thus would only drag her companions down. One had to be a fool or not fond of living to allow that to happen. So, which one of these descriptions suited Nephice? Somehow, he felt that neither did. The sunset was not far off when they reached the hill. After climbing it and approaching the massive growth of coral, Nephice dismissed the golden rope and immediately summoned it again. This way, it was untied and appeared in her hands in a neat bundle. Ah, so it's a memory. Sunny wondered what qualities the magical rope had. Soon, his curiosity was satisfied. Right in front of his surprised eyes, the length of the rope suddenly began to increase. Soon, it was thrice as long as it was before. Nephice calmly tied both ends of the rope into loops and then threw one of them into the air, accurately coiling it around a prominent protrusion near the top of the coral pillar. Then, she tested if the rope would hold, swiftly climbed up and waved from above, giving Sunny the signal to follow. After hesitating for a second, Sunny approached the rope and grabbed it. He couldn't help thinking that this would be the perfect opportunity to cut his head off. With him helpless while climbing and Nephice standing on the top of the pillar, the vivid picture appeared in his mind. Stop being paranoid, Sunny thought, trying to calm himself down. It's not that he was sure of Changing Star's impeccable moral qualities. Instead, he was certain of one thing: if Nephice really wanted to kill him, she wouldn't have needed to wait for an opportunity. She could have just cut him into ribbons whenever. Simultaneously scared and reassured by this though, Sunny nimbly climbed up and joined Nephice at the top of the coral mound. He then turned around and watched curiously, wondering how Kasha was going to get to them. The blind girl dismissed the wooden staff and approached the rope. Then she caught it in a hand, traced it down to the loop at the end, and placed her foot inside. As soon as she was done, Nephice grabbed the rope and started pulling, lifting Kasha little by little until she had reached the top. She only had to grab Nephice's hand and make a step to join them. Efficient. The coral mound was much larger than the circular stone platform of the giant knight's neck. In fact, it was almost like a small island. At the highest point of the island, hidden behind some coral blades, the girls had made a little camp. There were piles of seaweed to sleep on, strips of scavenger meat drying under the sun, and a fire pit. Sunny pointed to the makeshift fire pit. Was it you 2 nights ago? I've seen an orange light in the distance. Kasha's face darkened. Yes, this was the first time we made a fire. But it turned out to be a really bad mistake. Nephi sighed. Sunny raised an eyebrow, surprised. Why? The blind girl touched her hair and turned her head to Nephice. At night, any light will attract monsters. We were attacked by scavengers first. And then, she paled and didn't finish. But she didn't have to. The memory of the colossal tentacle was still fresh in Sunny's mind. It seemed that he was lucky to meet these two when he had. If not, he was certainly going to make a fire tonight to roast some scavenger meat. I see. Nephice looked at the sky and cleared her throat. It should be fine now. We still have time before the sun sets. After that, she got busy making the fire. Kasha simply sat on a pile of seaweed and waited. Not knowing what to do, Sunny lowered himself to the ground and let his tired, bruised body rest. After a while, he said, I have fresh meat in my rucksack. Do you have water? Kasha smiled. Yes. After that, she extended an arm to him. A second later, a beautiful bottle made of patterned blue glass appeared in her hand. That's a memory I have. It's always full. Sunny took the glass bottle and looked at it with envy. An endless supply of water, huh? Sure beats my super loud bell. Thank you. He brought the bottle to his lips and greedily drank the cool, delicious water. Indeed, no matter how much he drank, the amount of water inside did not seem to decrease. Is it really endless? Kasha touched her hair again. Not really. If you turn it upside down and let the water flow, it will stop in half an hour or so. But then it will be full again pretty soon. At that time, Nephice was already done making the fire. Without looking up, she took Sunny's rucksack and opened it. Immediately, the soul shard rolled out. The tall girl looked at it, then at Sunny. Then she put the shard back in and pulled out the meat. Sunny became tense, preparing a misleading answer. But Nephice did not ask. So, he pretended like nothing had happened and continued his conversation with Kasha. It's still a great memory. Getting drinkable water is not an easy task. Kasha nodded and smiled, pleased by his words. Soon, the rich smell of roasting meat permeated the air. At the same time, the sun was beginning to approach the horizon, a loud rumble came from somewhere beneath, and first traces of the black water began to appear between crimson walls of the labyrinth. Sunny looked east, where the skies were already growing dark. Then he uncomfortably shifted. Do scavengers come all the way up here? Nephice turned the meat and nodded. Yes. But only at night. In the day, most of them seemed to disappear. Sunny grinned, having an idea of why there weren't a lot of monsters in the labyrinth in the day. That's because they all gather near the place I had been spending my time recently. You should have seen it, the tall cliff to the west of here. Well, it's actually a statue. Kasha opened her eyes wide. A statue? But for you to survive, it should be. Yes, it's a giant statue of a knight, at least 200 meters tall. He is missing his head, so I hid on top of the neck. Anyway, the day we were sent here, two sea creatures fought each other near that statue. When the water receded, I saw an enormous carcass lying there, with hundreds of scavengers slowly tearing it apart. Nephice nodded. That would explain the lack of nightmare creature in the day. How long? Sunny blinked. How long what? Changing Star stared at him for a few seconds, making everyone feel uncomfortable. How long, until they are done devouring the carcass? Oh. 1 day more, 2 at most. Nephice turned away, took the meat away from the fire, and then quickly extinguished it. There's definitely something wrong with that girl. The three of them ate in the dimming light of the twilight. The meat was juicy, tender and indescribably delicious. It was better than anything Sunny had ever tasted, even back in the Academy's cafeteria. Of course, his excruciating hunger played a part in that. From time to time, they would pass the glass bottle to each other. When they were finished with their meal, the dark sea was back, and the night was upon them. Everything was consumed by absolute darkness. Of course, Sunny could easily see both Nephice and Kasha. Under the cover of the night, Changing Star remained pretty much the same. The blind girl, however, allowed her true emotions to show, thinking that no one would see. She seemed much more lost, lonely and frightened than she did in the day. As if trying to resist these feelings, Kasha said in a bright voice. How about we formally introduce ourselves? I'm Cassie. Nephice glanced in her direction and shrugged. Next, it was Sunny's turn. He exhaled, glad that they didn't ask his name directly. Most likely, he would still have been able to provide his human name, however, it also might have depended on the wording of the question. Relieved, he smiled and answered. I'm Sunless. But you can call me Sunny. Sunny was slowly growing fond of having conversations in the dark. Without the burden of light, people were more relaxed and honest. It reminded him of the frequent blackouts that used to sweep through the city when he was a little kid. His family had no choice but to huddle together and spend a few hours doing nothing but talking to each other. Now, these dark hours had become some of his most precious memories. He was silent for a few moments and then said, Since we're going to be depending on each other, should we share what abilities and memories we have at our disposal? This was a logical suggestion. If they were going to fight side by side, knowing each other's strengths was more or less vital. Still, he noticed Nephice glancing in his direction with a guarded look on her face. Luckily, he was obscured by darkness. I'll start, Sunny said, both to show his sincerity and to reveal information about himself in a controlled manner. If he took the initiative to talk, he still had to tell the truth, but how much and to what extent was still for him to decide. If they were to ask and he had to answer, however, things would become unpredictable. My attributes give me an affinity to shadows. I also have a slight affiliation to divinity. Lastly, I am prone to finding myself in unlikely situations. Cassie listened carefully, and then lowered her head, as though embarrassed. He is telling the truth. Not that we doubted your honesty. Why not? I spent so much time earning the reputation of a pathological liar. Sunny cleared his throat and smiled, hiding his nervousness. Really? That's good to know. But, why are you so sure that I am being honest? The blind girl shifted a little. Oh, that's my ability. I can see people's attributes. Sometimes, I also receive, visions. They can be about the future or the past. I mean, that's what I think. It only happened a couple of times. Sunny swallowed, but then relaxed. So, she is an oracle of sorts. Luckily, her insight is limited to attributes, otherwise, I'd be in real trouble. Still, I'll have to be careful around her. He finally realized how the blind girl had known about his birthday. The question was whether she had seen it in a vision of the future or in a vision of the past. If it was the former, was it safe to assume that he would certainly be able to celebrate at least one more birthday? Or did knowing the future actually affect it and changed it? For example, after learning that he was definitely going to survive, Sunny might have naturally relaxed and lowered his guard. Then, he would die as the result of it. It surely seemed possible, right? That's assuming that the future could be changed. But maybe it wasn't? Then, feeling his head hurting, Sunny decided to avoid this line of thought for now. Instead, he hid his inner turmoil and said in a friendly tone, "That's a good ability. Speaking of abilities, you have already seen mine. My shadow can move independently and explore. It can't affect the material world, but we share sight and hearing. That way, I can spot danger before encountering it. The shadow is fast and stealthy, it can go anywhere and is almost impossible to notice. Oh, I can also see in the dark." He smiled, expecting the girls to understand and appreciate the utility of his shadow scout. Their reaction, however, was a bit strange. Nephi slowly turned her head in his direction, while Cassie became a bit pale and raised her hands to cover her chest. What? Nephi frowned and said in a flat tone. "Have you ever used your ability in the academy?" Sunny blinked. What a strange question. In the academy? Sure, of course. Why? Oh, right, they think that I'm a pervert. Crap. Before the girls could say anything, he hurriedly raised his hand and blurted. But I have never used it to do anything improper. You have to believe me. Fortunately, it was the honest truth. However, both Nephi and Cassie looked skeptical. Sunny gritted his teeth. I had more important things to do then, than whatever you're thinking about. I spent almost every waking hour learning how to survive. Nephi raised an eyebrow. I haven't seen you in class, even once. Sunny chuckled. Of course, you didn't. While you were busy wiping the floor with other sleepers, I was studying wilderness survival. It was Changing Star's turn to blink. Wilderness, what? There is such a course? Cassie seemed equally puzzled. Yes, there is. It might seem like an afterthought for most people, but for an outskirts kid like me, who never went to a fancy school or saw a private tutor, learning how to survive in the wilderness is the difference between life and death. Without it, I would have drowned the moment we were sent to the dream realm. On a rare occasion, Nephi looked completely bewildered. She rubbed her wrists and stared thoughtfully in his direction. I see. I didn't know. Sunny grimaced and struggled to keep the venom from sipping into his voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was light and amiable. That's okay. It's natural for someone of your status not to know. When he mentioned her status, a strange smile appeared on the Changing Star's face. But in the end, she didn't reply. Sunny continued. Anyway, that's my ability. As for memories, I have 3. One is an armor, one is a sword, and the last one is a really loud bell. Now it was their turn to share. After a short pause, Nephi spoke. My attributes give me an affinity to light and fire, as well as a strong affiliation to divinity. I have 2 memories, a rope. While she was speaking, Sunny was looking at Cassie, trying to read her expression. From what he saw, Nephi was telling the truth, but also, not the whole truth. And judging by how hard the blind girl was trying to hide her true feelings, the secret hiding among Changing Star's attributes was not at all trivial. Interesting. And a sword. The rope is very sturdy and can change its length. The sword is very sharp and can protect its wielder against souls attacks, to a certain extent. My ability can be used to heal. Sunny didn't miss the wording of the last part. Can be used to heal, does this mean that its main purpose was something else? He was pretty sure that Nephi would not reveal all of her cards, just like him. However, healing abilities were extremely rare. Having one that could heal, but was not limited to healing, that would be simply unheard of. But then again, she was Changing Star, one of the few people in history to receive a true name in the first nightmare. If Sunny were to consider his own aspect ability, nothing seemed impossible. I wonder what's her aspect rank is. Outwardly, he pretended to be excited. You're a healer? That's great. Having a healer among us is incredible luck. Cassie nodded and smiled. Neph is also an amazing fighter. You should have seen her dealing with those scavengers. Well, I also did not actually see it. But it sounded very scary. Sunny didn't need anyone to tell him how formidable of a warrior Nephi was. He had seen it with his own 2 eyes. Sort of. Actually, they were his shadow's eyes. Well, whatever it had instead of eyes. Meanwhile, Cassie sighed. It's my turn? My attributes are nothing special. I guess I have an affinity to revelations and fate. My ability is like I told you before. It's not very useful. About my memories, I have 3, the bottle, the wooden staff and this armor. You already know about the bottle. The staff can create wind. The armor is actually of the awakened rank. Nef gave it to me when we met. It has a very powerful protective charm. So, she's not only carrying Cassie on her back, she even gave away her only clothes? An awakened rank armor, at that? What is Nephi's thinking about? The blind girl turned away and added after a while. I used to be a pretty decent fencer, before. Now I can't really fight. The last 2 sentences were obviously related to her flaw. Sunny and Nephi, however, both chose to keep their secret. Despite the fact that knowing your companion's flaw was also important for cooperation and having each other's backs, sharing something like that demanded a very high level of trust. Right now, there was no trust between them. And even if there was, Sunny did not plan to ever share his flaw with anyone. Nephi, too, seemed to have a lot of secrets. After a while, he said. Good. That's good. I think we have enough tools to survive, provided we use them right. I guess it's time to sleep? In the darkness, Nephi tilted her head, listening to his words with a distant look. All right. I'll take watch first. Sunny decided to be helpful and said. Actually, my shadow doesn't sleep. It can wake us up if something happens. Changing Star slowly smiled. I'll take watch first. Feeling a bit of coldness in her voice, Sunny sighed and shrugged. Suit yourself. What are you going to watch, huh? You can't even see anything. Whatever. Just don't blame me when something giant swallows us in the middle of the night. Then he suddenly shuddered. Wait, that was not a death flag, right? Right, of course not. No way. Sleep was avoiding Sunny. For a while, he sat silently in the darkness, listening to the calming rumbling of the waves. In this rare moment of respite, memories of the past few days came flooding into his mind. However, he was too tired to seriously think about anything. He was warm, full, and relatively safe. For now, that was more than enough. Soon, the rhythm of Kash's breathing changed, indicating that she fell asleep. Nephi was guarding the camp, motionless and, as always, a bit distant. With her silver hair and fair skin, she looked like an alabaster statue. Sunny sighed. He struggled for a bit, and then said quietly. Hey, can I ask you a question? Nephi glanced at him and shrugged. The lack of an audible response clearly indicated that she remembered about his ability to see in the dark. Sure. Would it be too personal? Sunny hesitated. I thought you legacies come into the spell with a whole inherited arsenal of memories. I mean, that's supposed to be your main advantage. How come you only had 3? Nephi was silent for a few moments. Actually, I only had 2. The rope came from Cassie. He raised an eyebrow. Oh, I see. Realizing that her answer wasn't really an answer, Nephi thought for a while and added. We lost most of our memories when my father passed away. The ones that remained were sold one by one over the years, to keep the family afloat. This sword and armor came from my first nightmare. So that's how it was. Sunny realized that the fall of the Immortal Flame clan might have been more thorough than he had thought. Still, something about it didn't make sense. Surely, with your clan's reputation and standing, there were other ways to make money. Without any strong reaction, Nephi simply said. There were other reasons. Then, she unexpectedly turned her head in his direction. Can I ask you a question in return? Sunny swallowed. Yeah, go ahead. Nephi tilted her head. How did you know that I'm a legacy? What? That's it? Simple. I heard Castor mention it. He was scolding other sleepers to make them treat you with respect. She gave him a nod and turned away. What thoughts were hidden behind her calm gray eyes, Sunny did not know. Some time had passed before he gathered enough courage to ask the question that he really wanted to ask. Before doing it, though, he made sure that Cassie was sound asleep and lowered his voice. Can I ask another question? Without getting a negative response, he continued. Why are you burdening yourself with her? A corner of Changing Star's mouth curled up slightly. Why? Wouldn't you? Sunny gritted his teeth, feeling the flaw pushing the truthful answer out of his mouth. No. To be honest, he wanted to believe to the last moment that the answer would be yes. But one of the things he had lost after the nightmare was the ability to lie to himself. Truth was merciless. It's not that Sunny did not pity the blind girl or didn't want to help her. It's just that he knew with certainty that it was simply not something he could do. He was barely able to save himself, let alone carry a helpless person across the dream realm. If he tried, they would just die together. Still, he couldn't help but be a little disappointed in himself. Nephise, however, did not seem to judge him. She showed no reaction at all. After a few moments, she simply said, "Because I want to." Because she wants to? That was not the response Sunny expected to hear. He was pretty sure that she would either lecture him about virtue and compassion or disclose some obscure way to make Cassie's seemingly weak ability incredibly useful. However, she did neither. Nephise expected him to believe that she was putting her life in danger, to the point of sacrificing an awakened armor-type memory, because that was something she simply wanted to do. Ridiculous. At first, he dismissed her response as a non-answer. But the more he thought about it, the more disturbed he felt. Because, maybe, it was actually the truth. Due to the circumstances of his life, Sunny had never really done things because he wanted to. Most of the time, he was doing them because he needed to. It was never a question of want, it was always a question of must. For him, this was a basic rule of life. But was it really? Or was it just a matter of perspective? Nephise had certain advantages in her upbringing, but they weren't as ample as he had imagined. She had no wealth and no arsenal of relics to empower her. However, she did have a mentality that was different from Sunny's. It wasn't impossible for her to have the audacity to disregard need in favor of something as frivolous as desire, and do things that a normal person like Sunny would never do. Like helping a blind girl simply because that was what Nephise wanted to do. Perhaps, that mentality was the greatest advantage of all. Perhaps, that was the real barrier that separated legacies from the rest of them. That was a lot to think about. However, before Sunny could gather his thoughts, Nephise suddenly spoke again. "My turn." Does she mean it's her turn to ask a question? Indeed, that was what she meant. Changing Star once again turned to Sunny and, after a long pause, suddenly asked, "Do you know the legend of Odysseus?" "A what? Who? What sort of a weird question is that?" Bewildered, Sunny shook his head. Then, remembering that she couldn't see him, he said, "No." Nephise sighed and turned away. A few moments later, she softly said, "Odysseus was a hero in an ancient war. In the legends, some humans back then had powers akin to the awakened. Achilles with an aspect of indestructible body, Diomedes that was so ferocious even the god of war was wary of him, Ajax who was as strong as a giant. Odysseus was not the strongest, and not the bravest. However, he was the most cunning." Sunny blinked, staring at the silver-haired girl. What? Where did this come from? Why is she suddenly so eloquent? Meanwhile, Nephise continued. In the end, Odysseus's cunning ended the war, and he prepared to sail home. However, the gods cursed him to endlessly wander the seas, never to return. Over the years, he survived one horror after another and lost all of his companions. Then, shipwrecked, he found himself on an island where the beautiful fairy, Calypso, lived. Changing Star's ethereal, strangely wistful voice resounded in the darkness, creating an enthralling atmosphere. Sunny couldn't help but listen with the utmost attention. Calypso fell in love with Odysseus and invited him to her palace. For many years, they lived together in harmony. The island was like a paradise, filled with all kinds of wonders, delicacies, and delights. As long as loving Calypso was by his side, Odysseus was even immortal. But, the longer he stayed, the more time he spent sitting on the shore, looking at the sea with bleak eyes. Nephise smiled. In the end, Odysseus built a makeshift boat and abandoned the island, leaving all its delights, the beautiful fairy, and even his immortality behind. So, my question is, why did he leave? Sunny blinked. What? What kind of a mind game was that? He even considered that Nephise was mocking him, but it didn't seem to be the case. It looked like she was sincerely interested in the answer. Weirdo. He thought for a bit, and then said without too much conviction. Maybe it was because he was far away from home? A fleeting smile appeared on Nephise's face. Far away, from home. Alright. After that, she turned away and lowered her head, becoming like a statue again. It seemed like their conversation was over. Grumbling internally, Sunny lay down and tried to fall asleep. However, the image of bleak-eyed Odysseus kept appearing in his mind. After a while, he whispered. Well? Did he make it back home? Soon, Nephise replied. Yes. He returned to his wife and son, and they lived happily ever after. Satisfied, Sunny smiled and turned on his side. When he was already half asleep, he heard Changing Star's quiet voice once again. This time, it was barely audible and aimless, as though not directed at anyone. Odysseus was the first human to break the will of gods. In the morning, Sunny and Nephise were the first to get up. While the sun was rising and the sea was retreating, they made a fire and began preparing a simple breakfast. With Kasia still asleep, they did not talk to each other much. It was like the last night's conversation did not happen. However, after some time, they somehow ended up discussing the plan for the next few days. Nephi had some ideas. With what you told us about scavengers crowding to the west, the logical step would be to start moving east as soon as we can. Of course, north and south are also acceptable, but that won't put as much space between us and the enemy. Sunny nodded, agreeing with that logic. We have explored to the east a little, but not enough to confidently make it to the next high point in a day. That's why the best course of action would be to spend today scouting a path to that group of cliffs over there and move the camp tomorrow. He sighed. Do you have any idea where we are? Would there be a human citadel to the east? Nephi shook her head. I've never heard of a region that fits the characteristics of this place. In any case, we have to move to find out more. We'll either find a citadel, encounter an unconquered gateway, or die. East is as good of a direction as any. Plus, it's the safest, because there's a horde of monsters to the west. At that point, Cassie suddenly sat up straight. Her eyes were wide open, and her face was a little pale. She looked nervous and excited. Nephi frowned. Cassie? What's the matter? The blind girl turned to them and smiled. A vision. I had a vision. Like, a prophetic dream? Sunny thought, trying to come to terms with this new reality of someone being able to see the future. Or the past. Meanwhile, Changing Star stretched her hand, as though prepared to summon her sword. Are we in danger? Cassie energetically shook her head. No, it's not that. People. I saw a castle full of people. She smiled and pointed with her finger. I don't know how far it is, but I'm sure that it's in that direction. Sunny and Nephi looked at each other, not knowing whether to be glad or petrified. Cassie's small, delicate finger was confidently pointing west. In the ensuing silence, the smile slowly disappeared from Cassie's face, replaced by confusion. Feeling the sudden tension, she asked. What's wrong? Sunny sighed. No, nothing is wrong. It's just that direction is the one we wanted to avoid. After some thought, he added. That's where I came from yesterday. There's a lot of scavengers down there. The blind girl's face fell. Oh. Nephi, who was quietly listening to them, gave him an indecipherable look and finally spoke. Tell us more about the castle. A shadow of the previous excitement returned to Cassie's eyes. With a serious nod, she began describing her vision. I dreamt of a vast, ruined city built of weathered stone. It was surrounded by tall, impregnable walls. Various monsters were wandering its narrow streets. In the center of the city, there was a hill, and on that hill stood a magnificent castle. She smiled. But there were no monsters in the castle. Instead, it was full of people. I'm sure that they were awakened. Some were guarding the walls, some were going about their lives without a care in the world. There was food, safety, and laughter. Well, that sounds great. If this castle really existed, then all of their problems would be solved. Sunny cleared his throat. Did you see anything else? Cassie frowned, trying to remember. Then, her face cleared. Yes. I saw Sunny leading me through the gates of the castle. That means we will make it. A brilliant smile appeared on her doll-like face, beaming with so much joy that Sunny couldn't help but curl his lips. Inwardly, however, he was stuck on a certain detail of Cassie's vision. It was that, when talking about reaching the castle, the blind girl only mentioned the two of them. Was there some meaning behind it? Sunny turned his head a little and secretly glanced at Nephi, trying to discern if she had picked up on that little discrepancy, too. Changing Star, however, was as enigmatic as ever. Without showing much emotion, she thought for a while, and then slowly nodded. Okay. Then we will go west. While the sea was still retreating, they had their breakfast and then spent some time planning for the journey and preparing to abandon the temporary camp. In the process, Sunny had a chance to get to know the girls a little better. It was then that he came to a sudden realization, which almost made his head explode from bafflement. That mind-blowing realization had to do with Nephi. Back when they first met in front of the academy's gates, Sunny had formed a certain impression of the confident, distant girl. Later, her behavior and the different revelations about Changing Star's past only served to reinforce that impression. Nephi seemed to exist a bit apart from the world. She was mysterious, aloof, and rather cool. Her taciturn character and strange speech patterns made people interacting with her feel unnerved and rattled, often revealing more than they had been planning to. The less she talked, the more she seemed to know. That silent, indifferent confidence was arresting, and sometimes even oppressive. However, that impression turned out to be completely wrong. The actual truth behind the matter had nothing to do with being cool and aloof. After talking to her a bit more and observing their interactions with Cassie, Sunny almost fainted when he realized that Nephice was simply an incredibly, ridiculously, painfully awkward person. It was as though she had no idea how to talk to people. Every time she tried to convey something, she would either use the wrong words or stumble in the middle of the sentence and fall silent. Her tone never matched what she was trying to say. Often, she would forget to put correct intonations in her speech, making questions sound like statements or vice versa. Added to that was the fact that, like many introverted people, Nephice was not in a habit of openly showing her emotions. It's not that she didn't have feelings, it's just that she was really bad at emoting them. As a result, her face always looked cold and neutral. That's why, most of the time, she simply chose to talk as little as possible or not to talk at all. All of that added up together, then multiplied by her general weirdness, was ultimately responsible for creating the false image of a mysterious, unapproachable ice princess. When in fact, she was just shy and completely inept in communicating with people. After coming to that realization, Sunny tried with all his might but still failed to stop himself from staring at Nephice with wide eyes. He just barely managed to not let his jaw hang open. What the hell? That's not in line with how a protagonist should be. In his mind, Nephice had definitely been the type of person to be the main character of any event. At the center stage, there were always confident, strong people like her and Castor. People like himself and Cassie, on the other hand, were relegated to exist far away in the background. Now, however, no, that line of thought was also wrong. The fact that Changing Star had problems with expressing herself and lacked social skills did not mean that she was not strong. In fact, it might have meant the opposite. She still achieved everything that she had achieved, but with the added layer of adversity. She was still dangerous. At that moment, Nephice finally noticed that Sunny was staring at her. She looked at him and, after a long pause, asked in an emotionless tone. What? He blinked, extricating himself from this sudden flood of thoughts, and cleared his throat. Nothing. I was just going to ask when are we setting off. Nephice appeared to be thinking. After a while, she turned away and said. Soon. You really can't manage more than one word, can you? Utterly bewildered, Sunny hid his emotions and smiled. All right then. In the gray light of morning, they abandoned the tall hill and ventured west, retracing their steps from yesterday. Knowing the path, the small party made quick progress. Nephice was walking in front, her sword arm ready to strike at any moment. A bit behind her was Sunny. This time, the responsibility of holding the golden rope and guiding Cassie along was entrusted to him. Of course, the actual creature, leading them was his shadow. It scouted ahead, carefully observing the labyrinth for signs of danger. The labyrinth was just as it was before, confusing and seemingly endless. Crimson blades of coral protruded from the black mud, creating a vast, tangled forest. However, today something about it felt different. It wasn't long before the shadow stumbled onto a mass of hulking, hungry scavengers. Halt! Sunny whispered, observing the group of scavengers through his shadow. As soon as the word left his lips, Nephice immediately summoned her sword. After studying the surroundings for a second, she turned her head and glanced at him with a question in her eyes. Kasha, meanwhile, froze in place and hesitantly raised her staff. Sunny counted the monsters, 1, 2, 3, 5. Curses. The hulking beasts seemed like the losers of the pack, similar to the one he had killed. However, their wounds were not as pronounced and terrible. Each of them was much more of a threat than the mangled one from before, and there were half a dozen of them at least. There are scavengers on the path ahead, 6 of them. They're slowly moving in our direction. Nephice cast a gaze forward. There was a calculating look on her face. They're done with the carcass? Sunny thought for a moment and then shook his head. No, I don't think so. But maybe there's not enough meat for everyone anymore, so some stragglers had no choice but to leave with an empty stomach. Nephice nodded and gestured to a nearby branching path. We'll circle around them. The 3 sleepers hastily moved forward and changed paths, giving a wide berth to the group of monsters. Tense and grim, they continued walking, trying to stay on course and not get lost in the labyrinth. However, in the next hour, they had to turn in a random direction again and again, avoiding other scavengers. The distance between them and the giant statue was not shortening at all. At some point, they were catching their breath near one of the numerous dead ends of the Crimson Labyrinth. They had no choice but to wait, since a large number of creatures was moving past their hiding spot, separated from them by a long length of a twisting coral passage. Sunny sighed and shook his head. We can't go on like that. At this rate, we'll never make it to safety before sunset. Cassie was the first one to react. Maybe we should turn back? That was a reasonable suggestion. However, Sunny felt reluctant to agree. Nephi shared his thoughts. With a blank expression, she said, "It will only get harder tomorrow." She was right. By tomorrow, there would be even more scavengers flooding the labyrinth. Then what should we do? Changing Star tilted her head, thinking. After a while, she turned to Sunny. Fight. Fight? Fight against dozens of those monstrosities? Was she crazy? Sunny tried to hide his derision as he spoke. I know that you are skilled with the sword, but have you forgotten that each of those things is a whole rank above us? We won't survive in a fight against many. Nephi nodded. We avoid large groups. Cut down smaller ones. After a moment, she added. If there's one or two of them, there's a chance. Sunny wanted to retort, but couldn't find a good reason. In the end, he gave up. Fine. Nephi stared at him for a while. Then, she suddenly asked. Have you studied the corpse of the scavenger you had killed? What was that supposed to mean? A bit surprised, Sunny shook his head. No. He was too busy being in pain and trying to make it to safety before the sea returned. And why would he study a corpse? Wait. I think Teacher Julius mentioned something. After a short pause, Nephi spoke. Scavengers have 3 weak points on their bodies. The first one is obvious, it's their joints. Anything that has to be flexible can't be too rigid. So, there's gaps in the armor above the joints. By targeting the joints, you can diminish their mobility and attack capacity. Oh, so, by studying a dead monster, one could better understand their strengths and vulnerabilities. This idea was so obvious that Sunny admonished himself for not realizing sooner. Meanwhile, Nephi continued. The second one is the same. It's where their torso connects to the carapace. If you manage to accurately hit that spot, you can heavily injure a scavenger and deal serious damage to its body. However, unless you succeed in severing its spine, the wound won't be fatal. It'll still be able to fight for a while. Sunny couldn't help but notice that Changing Star's awkwardness seemed to disappear whenever she talked about things that she felt confident about, like ancient heroes. Or killing things. Curious. The last weak point is on their back, approximately at the level where the eyes are. There's a slightly concave, discolored cavity in their armor. It is where several armor plates connect. The chitin there is comparatively thin. If you can pierce through it, you can destroy the brain directly. That will be a killing blow. That is good to know. However, that weak point was too high to be hit by a human. After all, scavengers were more than 2 meters tall. As though reading his thoughts, Nephi added. That weak point is very hard to target. Circling around a scavenger is almost impossible due to their size, speed, and the attack range of their pincers. She looked at him and calmly said. If we stumble on a single scavenger, I'll be the bait. My task will be to make it turn around and then restrain it, exposing the third weak point. Your task will be to kill it. Sunny gulped. What if there's 2 of them? As usual, Nephi paused before answering. Don't die. It wasn't long before they were left with no choice but to attempt a fight against a scavenger. Behind them, there was a long stretch of the labyrinth with no suitable branching paths for them to turn onto. Ahead of them, there was a small clearing with only one other passage leading out of it. Not far into that passage, a massive scavenger was moving slowly in their direction. Sunny quickly described the situation and waited for Changing Star's feedback. Without much delay, she gave him a nod. We fight in the clearing. After that, Nephi gently guided Cassie to the wall of the labyrinth and helped her find a place to sit. Wait here. We'll be back. After some thought, she added. Soon. As Nephi moved to walk away, Cassie grabbed her hand. Her face was pale and tense. Neph, you, be careful, okay? Nephi blinked and tilted her head a little. Then, she smiled. Sure. With that, she and Sunny hastily headed for the clearing. By the time they got there, the scavenger was seconds from appearing. Sunny's shadow flew out of the passage and reattached itself to his feet. Without having to discuss things with Nephi, he quickly hid in the shadows and waited there, hoping for a chance to attack. Nephi, on the other hand, strolled to the center of the clearing and calmly stood there, her shoulders relaxed and her back straight. An elegant longsword appeared in her hands, carelessly pointed to the ground. Not knowing what else to do, Sunny silently repeated her words. Don't die. A second later, the scavenger walked into the clearing. When his tiny eyes spotted Nephi, an evil light ignited in them. Without wasting even a second, the massive monster screeched and rushed forward to attack. Its huge pincer shot forward with terrifying speed, tearing the air in its path. Nephi swiftly sidestepped, dodging the pincer, then leaped backward, removing herself from the path of the rushing monster. Simultaneously, her sword flashed in the air, cutting deep into the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs. Azure blood spattered on the ground. Of course, this small wound was too insignificant to slow the scavenger down. With surprising agility, it twisted and delivered a crushing sideways swipe. Nephise, who just barely landed on her feet, had no choice but to deflect the blow with her sword. She managed to disperse most of the impact by holding the blade at the right angle, but the remaining force was still enough to throw her off balance. At that moment, the second pincer came down. Instead of trying to regain her equilibrium, Changing Star went with the fall and somersaulted over one hand, ending up distancing herself from the monster a bit. Her sword lashed out again. The follow-up attack followed almost immediately. However, Sunny did not care about the details anymore. The only thing he cared about was that, through this risky series of dodges and leaps, Nephise had managed to circle to the opposite side of the clearing, forcing the scavenger to turn its back to the shadow in which he hid. It's now or never. Gritting his teeth, Sunny lunged forward. Before Changing Star finished her last dodge. Before the scavenger's pincer crashed on her from above. Before Sunny had time to become scared. He closed the distance between himself and the monster and jumped with all his might, landing on top of its carapace. Then, he used all of his weight to thrust a hand forward. Azure Blade shimmered into existence in his grip and was immediately swallowed by the shadow. A breath later, the dark blade hit precisely into the concave, discolorated cavity in the scavenger's armor. With a crack, the chitin broke, allowing the tip of the sword to sink deep into the scavenger's body. The monster shuddered, and then heavily fell to the ground. Sunny was thrown from its carapace, landing in the mud with a roll. That easy? It was already over? As though to answer him, the spell's voice resounded in the air. You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger. Sunny was sprawled in the mud, looking at the sky. He didn't even have to catch his breath since the whole fight took less than 10 seconds from start to finish. No one was dead, wounded or even bruised, well, with the exception of the scavenger. It was completely out of his expectations. He glanced at the monster's corpse to make sure that it was actually dead, then summoned the runes and took a look at the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 16/1000. It was actually true. The mighty awakened beast perished just like that. And, although Nephise did most of the work, he was the one to deal the killing blow. Why can't it always be so easy? Sunny got back on his feet and dismissed the Azure Blade. Then, he remembered the words Master Jet had once told him, no one can survive in the dream realm alone. Back then, he noted her advice, but didn't really believe it. After all, he had always strived to be self-sufficient, not allowing himself to depend on anyone. In Sunny's mind, this was the true meaning of strength. However, now he was beginning to suspect that this logic was flawed. Indeed, having someone to share your burdens meant the difference between heaven and hell here in the dream realm. If he was alone, fighting against a single scavenger might have been the end of him. Similarly, even though Nephise was far more skilled than Sunny, it would have been extremely hard for her to defeat the armored monster alone, being that its weakest point was out of her reach. But together, they had accomplished it with relative ease. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, there was strength in numbers that surpassed individual power. In that sense, being able to depend on a group was not a sign of weakness, but, on the contrary, an important facet of personal strength. Lone wolves would always be at a disadvantage. That was another lesson to learn. It's not like I had much of a choice. He walked over to Nephise and checked if she was okay. Apart from slight damage to her makeshift seaweed clothes, everything seemed to be all right. She glanced at Sunny. Memory? He shook his head. Nephise sighed. It seemed that she was a bit impatient to get herself a suit of armor of her own. If Sunny was a gentleman, he would have suggested to loan her the puppeteer's shroud for a while, but alas, he wasn't. That armor was extremely valuable and had cost him a lot. Plus, unlike Changing Star, the picture of Sunny wearing nothing but a seaweed loincloth would have been more disturbing than aesthetically pleasing. So, he said nothing. Meanwhile, Nephise headed for the dead scavenger and said without turning her head, "Bring Cassie." With a sigh, Sunny turned around and left the clearing. Soon, he approached the place where the blind girl was waiting patiently for their return. Hearing his footsteps, she flinched and raised her head. Sunny? How did she recognize me? Ah, must be the way I walk. Yeah, it's me. Everything is over. Come on, I'll bring you to Nephise. Using the wooden staff, Cassie stood up and turned to him. Are you guys all right? Sunny smiled. Of course. We dispatched that critter in no time. Didn't even get a scratch. Cassie smiled with visible relief. Good, that's good. Oh, right, the rope? Sunny took the rope and guided the blind girl back to the clearing. On the way, he felt a bit weird. With the delicate girl walking behind him, he couldn't help but think of his little sister. As a toddler, she used to follow him around too, as though they were glued together. As the familiar pain stabbed him in the heart, Sunny gritted his teeth and tried to think about something else. It was all in the past anyway. Back in the clearing, Nephice was done breaking apart the scavenger's carapace. The shimmering soul shard was already in her hand. Without saying anything, she tossed it to Sunny. He caught the crystal and looked at her with surprise. "Why are you giving it to me?" Nephice blinked and stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then she said as a matter of fact, "I don't have pockets." "Oh." Still a bit bewildered, Sunny put the soul shard into his rucksack. But why wouldn't she just absorb it? He opened his mouth to ask the question, but she seemed to realize something and added, "We'll divide the spoils later." "Ah, all right." Nephice, meanwhile, turned to Cassie and said after some deliberation, "I was careful." Then, she smiled. "Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger." Sunny was feeling somewhere in between of being ecstatic and peeved. Throughout the day, they managed to kill 3 more scavengers, each time with not much risk to anyone except for Nephice. The process was largely the same. After discovering the monster, he would hide in the shadows, while Nephice would act as bait. Then, when the time was right, Sunny would stealthily approach and finish the fight with a precise strike of the azure blade. He was wondering if that was what being in the main hero's party felt like. To anyone else, maybe with the exception of Castor, dancing around a deadly awakened beast would have been a tall task, most likely ending with the dancer's death. Nephice, however, had managed to do it over and over again seemingly without too much strain. What's more, her performance was based solely on skill, with no aspect ability involved. In that regard, even Castor couldn't have done better. She was swift, calm, and precise. Every move she made was calculated and perfectly timed. She seemed to innately understand the flow and logic of combat, which gave her the ability to roughly predict what actions the mindless beasts would perform in the next seconds. Then it was just the question of physical prowess to evade and even manipulate them to a certain degree. Sunny had always known that skill and experience were more important than raw power, but by watching Nephice, he vividly understood just how vast the difference between them was. Even though his divine aspect allowed Sunny to exert more strength and speed than Changing Star, in an actual fight, he would never stand a chance. Of course, he was also an important part of every encounter. His role as the finisher was not trivial, and not just anybody would have been able to accomplish 4 kills with 4 strikes. Even though Sunny was not taught any elaborate techniques, he was still a somewhat experienced fighter. He had good physical coordination, combat intuition, and, most importantly, a cool-headed mentality. Not to mention the fact that they were only able to ambush the scavengers so effectively due to his shadow scouting them out in advance. All in all, it was an almost equal cooperation. Still, watching Nephice fight was nothing short of sobering. Trying not to get too dejected, Sunny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 22/1000. 8 fragments today. Pretty excellent. Currently, they were waiting on the edge of the labyrinth path leading directly to the giant statue of the Headless Knight. There was a group of scavengers between them and the statue, moving past without any haste. The sunset was near, but they still had time. Slowly, minutes flowed by. At some point, Nephice gave the command to move. Helping Cassie along, Sunny followed Changing Star and quickly traversed the open space between the labyrinth and the statue. Now, they only had to get on top of it. However, it wasn't that easy. Scaling the 200-meter-tall monument would have been hard in normal circumstances, but now, they also had to somehow pull Cassie up. Leaving her behind until they were at the top would not have been safe. In the end, Nephice and Sunny took turns pulling the rope every 20 meters or so. Cassie would hold onto the rocks and wait until they climbed higher, and then the process would repeat. It was slow and torturous, and by the end, Sunny's muscles were sore and almost on fire. But they managed to get to safety before the dark waters washed them away. As the night began to descend, the 3 sleepers sat in the center of the circular stone platform and rested. As they did not bring any materials to make a fire and it was already too late, there was no way to cook food. They ended up chewing on the strips of dried meat, passing the bottle of limitless water around. After some time, Nephice gave Sunny a sign to take out the spoils of today's journey. He took out the 4 shimmering soul shards and put them on the ground. Without any discussion, Changing Star moved 2 crystals in his direction and took 2 for herself. Then, she gave one of hers to Kasha. Sunny watched it in silence. By the time Nephice and Cassie had absorbed their soul shards, he still didn't make a move to take his. After a while, he took another crystal out of the rucksack and moved all 3 to Nephice. The silver-haired girl looked at him with surprise. "Don't you want to grow stronger?" Sunny grinned. "Of course, I do. But these won't do me much good right now. It's no secret that you are the main fighting force of our group. He sighed. The stronger you are, the better our chances of survival will get. Plus, it's not a gift. It's a trade. Nephi's raised an eyebrow. A trade? What do you want? Sunny deliberated for a few seconds before answering. It's rather simple. I will give you these soul shards, and all other soul shards I earn on the way to that castle. Then, he looked her in the eyes and said, in return, you will teach me how to fight. Nephi looked at him and contemplated. This time, she remained silent longer than usual. Sunny felt a bit nervous under her gaze, knowing that he was being evaluated. With Changing Star's skill and insight, it wasn't hard to imagine just how much she had gleaned from his battle performance. Both his current level and future potential must have been pretty much laid bare in front of her. Were they enough to make teaching him worth her while? After some time, she took the soul shards and nodded. Okay. Sunny smiled, congratulating himself on a successful deal. Not only did he receive a lot while not losing much, but he had also managed to create a bit of a favorable impression of himself in the eyes of Nephi and Cassie. As far as performances went, this was a great one. So when do we start? Nephi shrugged. Now. Now? Sunny glanced at the sun, which was already almost gone. Were they going to train in complete darkness? It wasn't really an obstacle for him. Changing Star, however. We will start with some words. That will be enough for today. After hesitating a little, she added. Cassie, you listen too. Sunny and Kasha turned to Nephi, listening to her like two obedient students. Despite the fact that their age was more or less similar, both knew that, in terms of martial prowess, their companion had authority that was as beyond theirs as a dragon's might was beyond that of a worm. Nephi thought for a while and then said, mastery of combat can be divided into two aspects. One is body, and the other one is mind. Training the body is not easy, but it is rather simple. All you need is repetition and experience. In a fight, things happen too fast to consider every detail in the moment. That's why your technique must exist in your muscles and bones, so much so that it almost becomes an instinct. She paused. You can achieve initial results through repetition. Then, it must be cemented through experience. The more battle experience you have, the deeper a technique will be assimilated into your body. There is no other way. 1,000 hours of training won't be as impactful as one real fight. Only those who survive countless battles can be truly in command of the body. That simultaneously made a lot of sense and no sense at all. On the one hand, the principle of improving through practice was quite logical. On the other hand, Changing Star's statement made it seem like all those lofty legacies with their years of training were nothing but harmless children. After all, no matter how good their tutors were, they had no real battle experience. But then again, she did wipe the floor with every one of them, excluding Castor, with no apparent difficulty. So maybe her statement was true. That, however, posed a question of its own. Just what kind of life had Nephi led to possess rich battle experience at the tender age of 18? Should I stop calling her princess? Meanwhile, Nephi continued. Training the mind, however, is not simple at all. That is because, once you reach a certain level of skill, the mind is where the true combat takes place. The outcome is often decided before your body begins to move. And to master the mind, the first step is to understand the essence of combat. However, very few people truly do. She looked at them and asked, what do you think that essence is? Sunny hesitated. The essence of combat? What might it be? If it was some other legacy, he would have been tempted to say something stupid like honor, valor, or duty. But he already knew that Nephi did not fit into the image of a noble aristocrat he had in his mind. She wasn't someone who followed empty words. After a minute or so, Cassie finally answered. Victory. And almost at the same time, Sunny said. Survival. Changing Star shook her head. No. Then she rubbed her neck and pierced them with a cold, fierce gaze. The essence of combat is murder. Cassie flinched and opened her eyes wide. Sunny frowned a little. Nephi, however, did not seem to care. In the same calm tone, she continued. At the core of it, there is only this: you are trying to kill your opponent, and they are trying to kill you. In the end, one of you will be killed, and the other one will be the killer. Everything else is just noise. Her words sank deep into Sunny's heart and reverberated there, causing something inside of him to resonate and awaken. Style doesn't matter. Weapons don't matter. Reason and intent do not matter. The only thing that matters is to be the last one standing. In this way, anything you do in combat must be viewed as only serving one of two purposes, either to kill your enemy or to prevent the enemy from killing you. Nephi lowered her eyes. If you can understand that, you will have enough clarity to master the mind. After that, Sunny couldn't fall asleep for a long while. He lay on the cold stone, looking into the darkness and thinking about what Nephi had taught them. Repetition, experience, clarity. These were the 3 keys to becoming a fearsome warrior. All 3 were important, but the last one was the most vexing. Was it really how Changing Star had said? Was there nothing at the core of being a warrior than a cold will to kill? Intuitively, he felt that it was indeed so. This ruthless truth was, in a sense, an amalgamation of all his life experiences. After all, for someone like him, life was nothing but a constant battle for survival. Someone always won, and someone always lost. The former got to live for a few more days, the latter, no one cared what happened to them. Of course, life was life, and combat was combat. To most people, they weren't one and the same. But what about the awakened? The sole purpose of their existence was to fight against the nightmare creatures. Very few could escape that fate. After coming to the academy, Sunny allowed himself to think that he had escaped the fate of always having to struggle at the edge of survival. But now, it seemed like he had just exchanged one battle for another. This was an uncomfortable thought. However, if he looked at it from a different perspective, did it actually mean that he always had a crucial advantage? Most of those chosen by the spell were forced to somehow adjust to this merciless way of life. But he had always lived like this. Was he actually one of the few perfectly suited to be an awakened? With this thought, Sunny fell asleep. In the early morning, he was awakened by a piercing scream.
Thank you so much. Visit us more for more novels, please. Like, subscribe to our channel.